The United Nations nuclear watchdog is confirming that Iran has surpassed its limit on uranium enrichment. This is just the latest violation of an agreement negotiated with world powers back in 2015. The U.S. pulled out of that pact last year. CBC's Arthi Pole is watching this story from our bureau in Washington. Arthi, can you tell us more about how the Americans are responding? What are they saying?
Well, you know, we did hear from the U.S. President Donald Trump yesterday as he just had a warning really for Iran, telling them to be careful. But today, in fact, we are hearing from the U.S. Vice President, who, interestingly enough, is saying here that, in fact, the U.S. is open to talking with Iran, but also emphasizing that they intend to keep America's priorities at the top of their list during those conversations, essentially also saying that they are going to protect U.S. interests and that they will not be bullied, so to speak. So let's quickly take a listen to what Mike Pence had to say today.
We will continue to oppose Iran's malign influence. We will continue to bring pressure on their economy. And under President Donald Trump, America will never allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon.
So again, we're hearing some strong rhetoric there, or strong words from the U.S. administration, but no real plan on how they intend to deal with this escalating situation. Just a brief recap, too. We know that it was over the weekend, in fact, that Iranian officials announced that they would be surpassing the limitations placed on them during the course of the Iran nuclear deal for the enrichment of uranium, which was set at 3.67%. It has been, as you mentioned, Diane, confirmed now by the UN nuclear watchdog agency that they have surpassed that number, which they did threaten to do and have in fact done now. So that is one part of the nuclear deal that now has been violated by Iran. In addition to that, we know that previously they had violated the levels of stockpiling that they were also supposed to keep under a certain cap. Now, this is also in reaction, of course, to the fact that the United States, they pulled out of this deal in May of 2018, and they in turn put a bunch of sanctions, punitive measures on Iran. Iran says that the country is suffering because of those economic sanctions that the U.S. has placed on them. And so they're now trying to get out of the deal, so to speak, by doing these symbolic steps, trying to put pressure on the other remaining EU nations, China and Russia as well, who are still part of the deal, to try and get them to mitigate the impact of the U.S. sanctions, or to try to get the U.S. back to the table, Diane.
Right. Now, you mentioned those other countries that have been part of the pact. What are any of them making any comment at this point of their reaction to what's happening in Iran?
Well, they are concerned with the situation and this development with Iran, in fact, increasing the level of enrichment of the uranium past what was agreed upon during that pact that was signed back in 2015. Now, it is important to note that this is more seen as a symbolic step, because still it is far from the 90% of enrichment that would be needed to create a nuclear warhead, but it is still intensifying the pressures on these other nations. Now, they were waiting, of course, for that confirmation from the UN nuclear watchdog to see if, in fact, Iran was acting on that threat. That is the case now, so we'll have to continue to watch for reaction. But they did urge Iran to stay within the limitations. Here is what the EU foreign policy chief spokeswoman had to say.
We have called on Iran to not to take further measures that undermine the nuclear deal, and we now strongly urge Iran to stop and reverse all activities that are inconsistent with the commitments made under the JCPOA. That also includes the production of low-enriched uranium beyond the respective JCPOA stockpile limits.
Now, tensions between Iran and the West have been escalating over the past few months. In addition to that, we should note that it was today that Iran also gave the remaining signatories of the deal a 60-day deadline to try to get the deal back on the table.
Okay,
Diane.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arthi. That's the CBC's Arthi Pole in Washington. Now, what is behind Iran's move to increase enrichment levels, and how could the U.S. respond? To help answer that and more, I'm joined now in Washington by Henry Rome. He's an analyst with the Eurasia Group, and he has a special focus on Iran. We have reached him in Washington. So now, Henry, we are reporting that the International Atomic Energy Agency says they have now verified that Iran has indeed reached these levels that were set in the deal. Just how concerned should we be about that?
Hi, Diane. It's great to be here. Thank you. Look, Iran right now is trying to build leverage, not a bomb. Its steps so far have been reversible if it chooses to do so, and they have been symbolic in that they are inching slowly over the restrictions imposed or that they accepted under the nuclear agreement. But it's not to say that we're not in a dangerous situation. The Iranian steps are risky, they're volatile, they risk rash reactions from international players, and it is significant as Iran continues to exceed these limits. And as was just said, the Iranians have set out another deadline set to expire in September where they will take additional steps. So I would say we're on a slippery slope at this point.
But what's the motivation behind this? What's the strategy that Iran is employing here?
Well, so for the first year after the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear agreement, the Iranian strategy was of strategic patience. They waited, they wanted to see what the other parties to the agreement were willing to do to help them out. But that changed at the end of April when the U.S. took moves to cut off Iranian oil exports. And now they're taking a much more forward-leaning approach, violating the nuclear agreement, attacking tankers shipping in the Persian Gulf, shooting down a U.S. spy drone. All of these steps are aimed at increasing pressure on the other signatories to come to their economic aid and to deter the U.S. from taking additional steps.
How likely is it that those other nations are going to come to Iran's aid?
Well, the other countries are in a really tough spot. The Europeans want to save the deal. This was one of the European Union's kind of crowning multilateral achievements. But they're very limited in what they can do because what Iran has demanded is that Europe resume the purchase of Iranian oil, which European governments cannot force European private companies to do. So the Europeans are trying to find other ways to satisfy Iran, such as creating a financial mechanism to bypass U.S. sanctions. But Iran has said that that is really insufficient at this point. So the Europeans are stuck in a very tight vice.
Now, we were showing a clip earlier of Vice President Mike Pence speaking. Excuse me. And he was, really sounding pretty hawkish there. The U.S. is not going to allow Iran to build a nuclear bomb and so forth. How would you describe the approach that the U.S. is taking so far towards Iran?
Well, it's not a singular approach. There are multiple approaches. And what Vice President Mike Pence announced is very consistent with what President Trump has said, which is that he wants to talk to the Iranians, but only but without preconditions and without the U.S. relaxing any of its sanctions. But there are different elements of the U.S. government that have different views on this. The National Security Advisor John Bolton is much more hawkish, as is Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, somewhat less so. And there are various views about how far to push the Iranians. I think the current view, coming out of the White House at least, is that if the Iranians said they wanted to come to the table today, the U.S. would be there and the negotiations would start. But from the Iranian point of view, they will not do so until the U.S. rejoins the existing nuclear agreement, which, as you heard Mike Pence say, they're not willing to do.
Right. So, both sides, Tehran on the one hand is saying, yes, we're open to diplomacy. Mike Pence apparently was saying, yes, we're willing to talk. But you're describing a scenario where it seems like there is absolutely no chance that they'll be speaking to each other.
Well, it's a dialogue of the deaf at this point, and they're really talking past each other. I think a very low likelihood at this point. I think if President Trump is reelected, I think the Iranians will have no choice but to talk. But until that point, they're just not willing to consider sitting down with somebody like President Trump.
Who would you say has more at stake here, Iran or the U.S.?
Well, Iran, I think, because their economy is under tremendous pressure right now. Their currency has lost 2/3 of its value over the past year. Oil exports, their most important export good for their foreign exchange revenue, down 90% over the past year. So it's a very serious situation. I don't think the Iranian government is about to collapse or anything close to that. But the situation is very severe, I would say.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing those insights with us.
Thank you.
Henry Rome is an Iran analyst with the Eurasia Group in Washington.